Well, here in Brussels, the reaction has been generally pretty positive to the speech. We haven't had any official reactions from EU leaders. We wouldn't have expected any. But people I've talked to here in town were impressed with the forthrightness of the speech, saying that this was the right tone of alarm at these alarming times that we're living in. I heard from several people today that they were impressed that he was willing to say things that other European leaders have not been willing to say out loud. The theme of the speech was about European sovereignty, which is a theme he touched on in his original Sorbonne speech 7 years ago. And he noted that back then it might have seemed like a kooky French idea, but now this has really come to the heart of the debate here in Brussels. What was interesting is that during that speech, there were kind of three enemies that emerged in terms of Europe needing to unite to be independent, and that was Russia, China, and the United States. And of course, a European leader saying negative things about Russia right now wasn't surprising, but it did surprise people how direct he was in criticizing China and the United States. For instance, he said that Europe needs to end its military dependence on the United States, that those days are over. He said that in dealing with international partners, the EU, in order to seem credible, needs to end the impression that it is, quote, the lapdog of the United States when dealing with other regions of the world. And he accused the United States and China of no longer abiding by the free trade rules that were written by the United States, essentially saying Europe can no longer naively remain the only one still respecting the rules of free trade, saying that if the U.S. is being protectionist by subsidizing its own companies, then Europe needs to do that as well and not be naively following rules that don't seem to be the consensus any longer. In talking to people here, one think tank chief said something interesting. He said, essentially, this has to be the wake-up call that Macron was not being overdramatic here, that Europe really does risk dying if it doesn't unite and create its own sovereignty, create its own independence. So the question, of course, in people's minds here is, who was this speech for? Was it for a domestic audience? Was it for European voters across the continent? What would be the effect of this speech? Is there a risk that he was just preaching to the converted?
You mentioned there, Dave, obviously it's interesting to hear about the US and how Europe is calling out one of its allies, but more particularly, of course, we still have Russia and China. If you're Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, what are you taking from Macron's speech?
Well, the criticism of China was in particular interesting for the timing, because we're supposed to be having a visit by President Xi to France in the next 2 weeks. And he did not hold back when he was talking about China not respecting free trade rules. He talked about China being in a group of, quote, authoritarian countries that have a different way of regulating the internet, basically a complete crackdown on content. He was contrasting that to the, quote, Anglo-Saxon model of laissez-faire touch on tech companies, kind of letting tech companies police themselves, saying Europe needed to find a third way there. But it was interesting. I mean, he did talk about the U.S. as an ally and said that even if the U.S. remains an ally, and that's obviously a big if with the upcoming U.S. election, that Europe is not a priority for the United States anymore. The priority for the United States is itself and China. So both of those criticisms, I think, were surprising, given that, the criticisms about the United States we don't hear very often from European leaders here in Europe, and criticism of China kind of tends to come and go based on timing, but you would have thought with that upcoming visit that the timing might be sensitive there, but Macron was not afraid to go there in this speech.
Very interesting rallying cry there from the French president. Dave, thank you so much for just updating us with that news. Dave Keating coming to us from Brussels. To the United States now.